Okay, great. Let's get started. So thank you everybody for joining. My name's Chaz. I'm the Aptible CEO, one of the co-founders. Really excited to have you with us. This is our second quarterly update. We did our last one in October. So this is going to cover everything we've shipped since October, essentially. The update is going to be broken into two pieces. Let's see if I can advance my slides here. We're going to cover a preview of a new product that we're launching separately called Gridiron, and Skylar Anderson is here to explain that. He's our Gridiron lead. And then we're going to cover all of the Enclave features and updates that we've shipped since the last one. And Thomas Orozco is going to cover that, and he's our Enclave lead. After that, we'll take questions. There's a Q&A feature, and I believe a chat feature. The Q&A feature works really well. So if you have questions while we go, just drop them in the Q&A. And we will address everything either live during the webinar as we go at the end, or we'll follow up with you after this. The webinar is being recorded. We'll post the video later. We'll post a link on our blog and send you an email with the link and the slides too as we get going. Our CTO, Frank McCurry, is here as well, and he'll be moderating questions and things like that. So again, thank you everybody for joining. Really happy. Our main goal at Aptible is to help developers, especially cloud-based developers, keep data secure and have good security practices in the cloud. And Gridiron and Enclave are both the main ways that we're going to do that. So I'm really excited to introduce Skylar here, who's going to tell you a bit about Gridiron.
Thanks, Chaz. Let's see. Okay. Sorry for that brief delay. Yes, I'm Skylar Anderson. I'm a lead front engineer here at Aptible. Primarily, my focus has been on this latest version of Gridiron. Some of you may already have access to a version of Gridiron, maybe the V1 that used to live on compliance at aptible.com. We've started to roll out, kind of preview some feature releases to select customers, and we're now opening up to a more general beta release. Today I'm going to cover some of the philosophy behind Gridiron, who the target market might be, some of the basic features, and then have a moment to answer any questions. So to get started, who is Gridiron for? Gridiron is really for, it's the first security program management tool dedicated for cloud-first engineering teams. Some of you with a history of managing compliance might have used other tools that are more enterprise, like on-premise focused risk management tools or those sorts of things. We're not that. We're focused on cloud-first companies that need to scale fast, that are used to building their software in the cloud. They might be deployed on our Enclave product. They might be deployed on AWS directly. The SaaS tools and the way their workforce and company operates is around the cloud, and they're comfortable working there, and they need to manage their security program accurately to represent cloud-based teams. What is Gridiron? Gridiron really is a suite of tools to help you manage your security program. It's a number of small tools that kind of together help you build and define your security program. What this does for you is it actually makes the administrative side of protecting data and having a security program very easy. It's not Excel spreadsheets, it's not long questionnaires, it's very basic questions focused around what we know about deploying an app in the cloud and companies built on the cloud. It helps prep for regulatory audits. So we maintain a mapping between all of our security controls to actual sections of the security rule of HIPAA and can help prove compliance. This also works great for selling into customers. We provide professional documentation that you can provide directly to your customers as proof of compliance without going through the paperwork every time. Instead, you have a central repository to store all this data. So one way to think of it is like Gridiron is to data security as QuickBooks is to accounting. You may not know all the tax law and everything behind accounting, but you can answer the questions and QuickBooks can guide you to getting to a result. Gridiron is very much the same in that regard. So what is Gridiron not? It's definitely not this. So those of you that have had to respond to like an audit from a customer have probably seen a security questionnaire like this. Hundreds of vague questions that you don't know how to answer. You have to pass the Excel spreadsheet from person to person in your organization, different technical or administrative leads in your company. And it's scattered about many different people, many different documents, and you might have to do this every time for every system you're selling into. This is not what we want to do. This isn't at all what Gridiron is about. Instead, Gridiron is something more like this. This is our philosophy on Gridiron. It's rather than like a point-in-time snapshot of your compliance at any given time, it's more of a flow, starting first with your risk analysis. This is the step of setting up your security program where Gridiron will guide you through analyzing the threats relevant to you and your company. It takes into account a number of predisposing conditions, namely like how you're deployed, what sort of SaaS tools you're using, and then analyzes what threats are relevant specific to you and recommends actual security controls that you can implement to help mitigate those. Coming out of that, we help write your policies and procedures, and these are customized to your specific profile based off how you answered some of the questions in your risk assessment phase. We also ensure that everything you're doing inside your policies and procedures and the security controls you're implementing are properly mapped to actual regulations and that you can easily prove compliance in real time at any given time. And there's no more security questionnaires that we can build those automatically for you. Out of your policies and procedures, we help drive security and privacy training. This is, again, highly customized to your specific risk profile. This includes things like how you're deployed, how you're securing your deployments. If you, for example, require MFA for all accounts, how that's configured, even how you handle pull requests in your secure software development lifecycle. We get very specific in the amount of controls we collect. And then we're able to distribute that to your workforce in real time. And even as it's changing, if you're making changes to how you implement certain controls or your policies, we help ensure that you've properly distributed that to your workforce. Coming out of the privacy training is operations. That's essentially the phase where you're running your business and we're informing how you can do that better. So what security controls you could implement, enforcing periodic access control or audit log reviews every month. We can help write a policy and actually send notification reminders each month telling you which systems and which aspects of a given system you might need to review. For example, on AWS, you might have to review IAM users every month along with bucket access logs and those sorts of things. And then generally operations leads back into the risk analysis. So your own assessment in your operation phase can help you determine new risks or new controls you may need to start planning for. Off to the side, occasionally out of operations, you may have a breach or some incident that you need to respond to, and we help you manage those. So the workflow of identifying the incident, documenting it, setting up some remediation steps, which could lead into the risk assessment. So you might need to remediate and fix, actually implement a code change to fix a bug. It may mean retraining a team or some particular members of your team. And then we help you perform like a retrospective on that incident and how you can improve over time. At the core of all this is what we call the Gridiron risk model. This is everything we know about your company. It's everything Aptible knows about the industry. And it kind of combines them all into a data model that can inform all steps of your security program. So at any given time as your company is changing or as the industry is changing, you're actually consuming those updates in real time to all of the pieces of your security program. And for all of these, we have tooling built out that makes every one of these easier. And then they're all connected through a single data structure that knows everything about your security program and is able to build dynamic documents like policies and procedures or specific training programs. And it's always dynamic and always real-time to the settings that you have configured in your risk model. So if I expand on that data model just a little bit, we can kind of see the different layers coming out of it. At the base is industry standards. A lot of the things we're using as a part of your model are not things we made up. They're coming from different vulnerability or attack databases like CVE or CWE from Meter or The mappings of different controls to actual regulatory frameworks comes from the CCM, the Cloud Computing Matrix. That's kind of the root of your data model. On top of that, we have the Gridiron Shared Intelligence data. What that is that's essentially our expertise and our years of experience working with digital health startups. And we've sanitized and reduced the vulnerabilities and attacks that are out there to the most relevant to cloud-based engineering teams. So you're not overloaded with tens of thousands of vulnerabilities that don't really affect you. Instead, we've distilled those down to simple questions like, do you deploy on Enclave, or do you deploy on EC2? Do you store PHI in S3? With simple questions like that, we can then narrow the scope of your risk assessment to only the most relevant controls. And that's leading into the next phase, which is the customer profile. That's everything we know about you in the systems or SaaS tools that you use to store regulated data. This is how most of the customization to your risk profile is surfaced. It's simple questions like how you're deployed, how you do pull requests, those sorts of things. And that ultimately builds your own unique risk model, which, as I said in the previous slide, identifies is injected into all phases of the compliance model and is used as the seed data for all those different tools. So you're not starting with a blank slate. Instead, you're starting with these layers already presented to you. So what this looks like, it's much easier to use than Excel spreadsheets. Here's an example of our risk assessment dashboard. We're analyzing risk by tier, and this changes over time. Just the most minor changes to your security program can actually make significant changes to your overall risk profile. So for example, if you implement MFA for all accounts, that's a really big security control that actually will affect many vulnerabilities and can greatly reduce your overall risk profile. So if you were to change that security control, you would see this change quickly. Same with something like background checks, anything that hardens actual end user equipment. So like disk level encryption, mobile device management, those sorts of things, map to a lot of vulnerabilities for a lot of different systems. And we can help point you in that direction of what security controls are going to have the biggest win as far as reducing overall risk. This is another view of the current risk assessment. I'm essentially looking at threats that are relevant to me. I can see based off likelihood, meaning the chance it's going to happen, the impact, and then the risk levels, which is like an overall quantification of the other attributes. I can see other components of my risk model, like vulnerabilities, predisposing conditions, and then ultimately security controls. If I wanted to see, for example, a prioritized list of controls I should be implementing to reduce risk, I can see which vulnerabilities it'll affect and know that they're specific to me based off my security program and how I'm deployed in my workforce in my unique situation. Here's our training dashboard. To start, we're rolling out these 3 basic HIPAA courses, well, basic, advanced, and security officer. We're going to expand on this in the coming months. The key thing is this is actually highly customized training. It's no longer static. It's using the data that you've provided in your security program and the policies that we've generated to actually customize this training unique to each customer. We'll expand on the library as time goes on. And here's an example of how easy it is to customize. So this is very different than even the language, and the copy here is much easier to digest than what you might have saw in like the CAKE questionnaire, that Excel questionnaire I showed. It's very simple questions. And by answering these, what we've done is actually map this particular security control is mapped to a number of vulnerabilities. And depending on how you answer a control or the questionnaire attached to it, we're actually mapping different efficacies of that control to different vulnerabilities. So you're actually changing your risk profile just by specifying additional metadata. So for example, in this code reviews, if you don't do code reviews, or if you only do code reviews for major code changes, that has a different risk profile than if you do them, or you do them for all changes. For example, if you're very stringent, that might be more effective at certain vulnerabilities than not. And this is just an example. There's hundreds of security controls, and we're importing them all the time. And as we're adding new systems that we support, we'll be adding the security controls and the related vulnerabilities for you. So next step is pricing. Gridiron pricing starts at $199 a month, paid annually. And we are offering, like I said earlier, a beta access for those interested. If you are interested in moving forward or seeing a demo at least, email Shah. He's our sales guy. He can get you set up with myself or Chaz to do the demo and walk you through Gridiron and how it can help improve your security program. That's it for the preview. I'm open to any questions.
Thanks, Skylar. So I got a couple questions that were sent by direct message. So just as a side note, folks can continue doing that, or there's a Q&A dedicated box. If you click the Q&A tab, you can also ask your question there. And any that come up, you know, that you still have, feel free to post them in there. And you can post them at any time, and we'll collect them at the Q&A breaks. But the couple that I got so far, Skylar. So first, will Gridiron help with SOC 2 or PCI compliance?
It'll definitely help. So the focus for Gridiron right now is on HIPAA specifically. What that really means, though, is that the mappings that we're storing for different controls are only there for HIPAA. As far as actually setting up a hardened security program and getting everything in one place and having all your training, documentation, risk assessment, policy manuals all in one place rather than all over the place, it'll definitely help in prep for that. And even the automated reporting and professionalism in presenting this documents to an auditor, it'll absolutely help there. We're moving more towards opening it up and storing more mappings of controls to different frameworks. Once that happens, then we'll be able to generate like audit reports specific to SOC 2 or ISO and not just HIPAA. That's in the works.
Cool, thanks. Another question was, with Gridiron, so like if we're using Gridiron, what else do we need? So I guess you know, what other things do we need to be doing as part of a compliance program?
I can help answer. Yeah, I can help answer that one. Generally speaking, you're going to want an independent third party to help you with security assessments. That might be something as simple as web application vulnerability scanning up to pen testing or like a more formal or extended security assessment. So you can get started very easily. But because from up until now, we have hosted all of our customers on Enclave, we haven't been into providing security assessments because we're not an independent third party. When somebody assesses the security of an Enclave customer, they're assessing Aptible and AWS as well. So for now, you'd need security assessment services.
Awesome. Thanks, Chaz. Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Skylar, for presenting Gridiron. Anyone who has additional questions about Gridiron, we're going to have another final Q&A at the end. So feel free to continue either DMing me these questions or dropping them in the Q&A box, and we'll collect them at the end of the webinar. But for now, I would like to hand it over to Thomas, who is going to tell you about some of the Enclave features that we've developed in the last quarter.
Thanks, Frank. All right, so let me set the sharing. All right, so I was talking about what changed in Enclave this quarter. So first off, I wanted to, before jumping into features, just mention a few like guiding principles that have like essentially driven the decisions we've made and the features we've added. The bottom line is we really want like Enclave to be the best place for you to launch like regulated or sensitive projects, historically like mostly like HIPAA compliance projects. And as such, so like three things you cannot live without. As like most of you as customers probably know, like you need a robust hosting platform, you need deployments to be reliable. You also need like good options to store your data. So you want like some flexibility there. And finally, you need like uncompromising security all the time. And these are the essentially what we focused on, probably with an even greater emphasis last quarter. So speaking of what's actually like in terms of features, what's new. So the deployment platform itself changed. We have a new engine that's running it, and I'm going to go into more detail. Obviously, that's why we're here. But this essentially, we have a new engine that will make your deployments essentially faster. That also makes your deployments more reliable as well. We're also about to provide like more options and control for your databases. So by options, we have things like you can now use Redis for PHI via Redis via SSL. We also have more control in the sense that you're now able to use like control like access database logs for your databases. We are also like providing broader operating system support so that you can access your like Aptible resources in the first place, and specifically this is coming to via Windows support. So let's jump in and look at the changes to the deployment platform now. So as I mentioned, like 3 main changes here. The first one is like the actual deployment engine itself was overhauled. This brought like 2 main core features. One is like the ability to systematically roll back if things go wrong at any point. Another one is faster deployments in general. We also rolled out a new, more secure version of our SSH portal. So you may not be familiar with what this portal is, but it's essentially what the CLI uses to connect to Aptible when you run things like a database tunnel. And finally, we are like introducing automated Orphan container deletion. This is more of a subtle and I could even say like obscure feature, but for those that have experienced this in the past, it will surely be a welcome one. So I'll explain once we get there, I'll explain exactly what this means. So let's start and focus with the engine overhaul. So the biggest change here is that we used to have a more monolithic approach to deploying your apps, whereas right now, essentially, we're taking your deployment and breaking it into plenty of little steps, which we then coordinate to form essentially a chain of dependencies. And if you've like deployed an app on like recently or restarted an app, these are actually like steps that you see in your log output. So this is like an example log output of restarting an app. And you can see you have like starting register service web in API. Well, that's one step. You can see it's a pretty small one. We're just like creating a record in our API. And essentially, like, your entire deployment is going to be made up of like these small steps that we then coordinate. And like I'm going to be essentially for a few minutes now talking about why that matters and why that changes for you. But first, like if you wanted a more visual approach to this, this is an example coming from an internal tool we use. So this is for like provisioning the database. But as you can see, we have like we create a new volume for the database, and we choose the instance we need, we attach the volume, then we mount it, and essentially have like all these little steps, as well as their dependencies. We can see in the form of arrows there, right there, essentially. This is what makes up like the deployment or like the database provisioning itself. And of course, it's a little more complex than just this. It looks a little more like this. Like this is what provisioning a new database looks like. So now, like at this point, like the real question is, like, why is this useful? Like, how is this going to serve you as customers? And the answer is twofold. Like first, it's going to make your deployments safer via the ability to systematically roll back everything. Second, it's going to provide faster deployments by running different steps concurrently. And one thing I should mention is that when I say deployments, I mean that pretty liberally. It's going to be deploying your app, but also restarting it or provisioning a new database and so on. So really any operation you execute on Aptible. So looking at like these rollbacks, the idea really is that now we have an engine where everything, like rollbacks are built into everything we do. So if you look at your deployment and you assume it's like, you do A, then B, then C, then D, which is good. Well, the good thing is if you need to roll back at any point, the path to rolling things back is pretty obvious. If you finished, all you have to do is you undo D, then you undo C, you undo B, you undo A. But if something unexpected happens, like D happens to fail, then in that case as well, like the path like to rolling back and getting things back into the right state still is pretty obvious. You just need to like undo C, undo B, and undo A. Now, of course, like our real deployments are a little more complex than this. There's more than just 4 steps. And also, like most steps have multiple dependencies. But the bottom line is that with this, we're essentially like able to handle any error that shows up, even if we've never seen that error before, which is pretty valuable when you're deploying on, say, AWS, where like sometimes APIs fail, or we may get errors that we've never seen before because they haven't actually existed in the past. But we get a new error from an API. Well, now we're like able to handle that properly and as best as we can to make sure that your apps stay available no matter what happens. Now, like errors are one case where you want to roll back, but another case, which is less unfortunate, essentially, is you may decide to want to cancel your deployment at some point. You realize that maybe the health check is failing and it's never going to succeed, or maybe you're deploying and then you realize you don't actually want that to go out. Well, now, like as of again Q4 of last year, you're able to actually cancel a deployment, just saying, I don't actually want this. And Aptible will acknowledge that and roll your deployment back, just as if it had hit like any random failure, essentially. Besides that, it's also helpful for us. It gives us really the ability to like troubleshoot failed deployments more easily. So the screenshot is coming from the actual tooling we use. Hopefully you don't actually need to work here to know what's wrong with this deployment. So don't try reading it right now. But really, like, the global view is like you have a bunch of stuff that's green, presumably that's good, and you have a big red dot in the middle. If we zoom in a little bit, obviously this is indeed a problem. This red dot is what caused the deployment to fail because the health check failed. Now, the usefulness of this is that, like, for our support team and for us, when you have a problem, we're able to respond much faster. We don't need to look at logs. We don't need to like scroll back into the logs to figure out what happened. We just have to like open this up and we'll know exactly what failed and why it failed. And also in most cases, why it failed as well. So that makes our support more efficient. But that's not all. Like, besides like that efficiency, besides that ability to really like roll things back at any point, making your deployment safer, this new engine is also faster. Since we have like all these little steps, in most cases, there's no reason to like, do them sequentially. To give you an example, if you have multiple endpoints for an app, there really is no reason to like provision them one after the other when you're updating your app. We can just do them in parallel. And like the example I'm seeing here is you have like A1, A2, and A3. You need to do all these things. Well, there's no reason that they have to happen like sequentially, since like the only actual like synchronization point, the only actual dependency is B that you're going to do later anyway. And so in this case, what we'll do is we'll just run A1, A2, and A3 in parallel, and then B will just happen afterwards, thus making your deployment faster overall. And so the impact of this will depend on your deployment, will depend on your app. If your app has like a long build process, you'll see like a shorter impact, but on restart, you'll probably see a large impact. In fact, we have some example apps, like actual apps running on Aptible that we're using as examples. That's what I mean by that. We have some cases where like a restart used to take 10 minutes because they had a lot of endpoints, and now it takes 2 minutes. If you're using that to try and recover from like a failure, or if you have a hotfix that needs to go to production faster, obviously you just like gained 8 minutes of availability right there. So the bottom line for you really is, as of, again, that shipped a couple months ago, but essentially your deploys are faster and safer than they ever were. Our support is better equipped than it ever was. And like, just as importantly, you didn't actually have to do anything to get this. This all shipped transparently. And these features are just available to you now. Now, there is one little caveat to this. There always is. These features are only available on our V2 platform. So if you're on our legacy V1 infrastructure, you will need to upgrade to V2 to get them. Now, the good news is, if you're not sure, you're probably already on V2. Like, V2 has been the default for over a year now. It's like, it started being the default in November 2015. So unless you know that you're on V1, you're probably on V2. But if you do want to check, just reach out to support. Otherwise, like in most cases, we probably will have reached out to you already if you're on V1 to schedule your upgrade. Did we have Frank, do we have any questions on that specific part?
We did. Thanks, Thomas. There's just one question. The question is, my deploys are still taking 15 minutes or more. Do you have recommendations for how I can make these faster? I know you talked about some of the ways that the engine improvements will make deployments faster across the board, but for customers who are still seeing slow deployments, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Essentially, like when you deploy an app, most of your time ends up, like there's really two phases. The first one is building an image for your app. And the second one is essentially taking that image and deploying it across our infrastructure. The second part is the one we optimized. And this one, at this point, should like usually take like a maximum of about 10 minutes. because everything happens in parallel, there really isn't anything that's going to have that's going to grow over time depending on how big your app is, essentially. Even if you have 20 endpoints and like 100 containers, even in extreme cases like this, it shouldn't take much longer than like the most trivial app to deploy. However, like the part that is going to change quite a bit is when you build the image. So at the initial Docker build phase, the one where you actually do get to see the Docker build output, this particular phase, this one really depends on your app. It depends on what you're doing in your build process. It depends on the state of caches and so on. There's two things you can do there. The first one is you can review your build process and see if there are ways you can make it faster, just like review Docker best practices and see if there are improvements you can make. The second one is you can build somewhere else. Just build off of Aptible, possibly getting a bigger instance, and then just use what we call like private registry deploys, like deploying from a private registry. We touched upon that, like we presented that feature on the last webinar, so you can review it there. But this will let you like build somewhere else and then just push that to Aptible essentially. Which will make your deployment much faster because you don't actually have to do the build when you do that. That being said, this is something that's on our roadmap to try and improve. Like in general, we'd like to make deployments even faster without you having anything to do. So there might be changes coming there as well. Was that anything else, Frank?
That's the only question for right now.
Right.
But if anyone has additional questions, again, just drop them in the Q&A.
Great, thanks. Right, so the next main change that has happened on the deployment platform is a new SSH portal. So the SSH portal is what you use when you run things like Aptible SSH, Aptible dbtunnel, or even Aptible logs. Essentially, it's like it kind of like punches a hole into your stack for you, and it runs on your dedicated stack. That being said, like evidently, like it's obvious it's a pretty sensitive piece of our infrastructure because like it's receiving requests on the entire internet and it's accessing your stack. So what we did is we like essentially beefed up security. It used to require just an Aptible access token to access. Now it also requires a temporary SSH key. That key itself is valid for 15 minutes, and it is tied both to a single operation as well as to a single user. So this is going to give us like a really good picture of exactly what's happening when someone connects to that portal. And the logs you're seeing below, these are logs from that portal, and there's like a piece of it, the middle line that says, you know, like SSH portal connection dash, and then there's like a UUID after that. This uniquely identifies the credentials that were used to log in. And using this, we're able to say exactly, essentially, like this is Thomas, and he's connecting to a dbtunnel. And not only can we say that's what he's planning to do, it's also the only thing he can do when he connects. So right there, we essentially we gain two things. One is we have like some essentially defense in depth. Like we used to have one layer of protection, now we have two. So that's at least, I'd argue, at least 2 times better. We also have strong auditing capabilities, which you can get access to as well if you have a need to understand what happened. If you have a requirement to, from like an auditing perspective, for example, we can help you like via those logs that we have. That being said, I should mention you will need an up-to-date CLI to use this. So you'll need 0.8 or greater. Since like older CLIs will continue to connect to the older SSH portal. Now, obviously, the goal of this change is to reduce our attack surface. So these old SSH portals will eventually be going away. So if you need, like if you're using the older CLI, it will eventually stop working. So make sure you upgrade. You can do that at aptible.com/support/toolbelt, and you'll get the newest version, which right now is 0.8.4. All right, and that takes us to the last feature of the deployment platform that shipped. It's a feature we call Orphan container deletion. So some of you may have hit that in the past. Orphan containers essentially, but the way, like here's how they're created. Sometimes you try to deploy your app, and we have old containers for your app, but sometimes these are running on an instance that's not responding. So when we deploy your app, we can't shut them off because the instance is not responding, maybe because the network is down or something like this. And in that case, we have to choose, like, do we stop the deployment because of that, or do we just move on and leave those behind? And in practice, what we do is we move on and leave those behind because you don't want to hold up your deployment due to an unresponsive instance because that would destroy your ability to even fix the problem in the first place. So we leave them behind as orphan containers. Now, the problem is these do two things. First one, they waste like some system resources, like they'll use some RAM, they'll use some CPU when like they shouldn't even be here. So eventually, evidently, they're using resources. and wasting them. But more problematically, sometimes they can break like background processes. Like if you're using Sidekick or Celery and you push a job to your background workers, and an orphaned background worker picks it up, it's going to be an old version of your code. In some cases, if you're lucky, it's going to work, but that code hasn't changed. But if you're unlucky, that code has changed. Maybe the job itself is new, and in that case, it's just going to fail. Whereas there might have been like a perfectly good new worker right next to it, ready to pick up that job, but the orphan got to it first. So the good news is here, we now clean those up for you, so you don't have to do anything. It just works. And those containers will like not bother you again in the future.
So there's no questions on that section. Actually, someone just asked. So I was thinking, is there a way to get SSH etc logs and other access to the, so basically asking if there's any way to get Aptible SSH logs, I believe.
I see. Oh, I see. Yeah. So Aptible SSH logs, not currently, no. So logs, like by Aptible SSH logs, I mean like logs from an SSH session. That's currently not possible. It's a feature we've considered. We don't have like any firm plans to implement that right now, but it's something we've heard several times in the past. So we're definitely considering it. Like a few reasons not to do it. Like SSH sessions are really likely to expose PHI, a lot more likely than just regular app logs. Because usually when you get in, there's a problem to fix, and like you're usually not. You're trying to fix it now, and you don't necessarily have as much time to think through, what's going to print out. And like another reason is they may in some cases like like humongous amounts of logs if you're like logging a lot. So for now, like logs from Aptible SSH are not available. They may eventually become, but we don't know that just yet. If you were asking about the logs from the SSH daemon itself, like the one we were seeing, the logs I showed before, these aren't available either at this moment, mainly because like, especially on shared stacks, it's not just yours. But these are like more useful from like an auditing perspective. And we, if you're like under an audit and you need access to these, we'll be happy to help.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Thomas.
Thanks.
Another, I guess, important questions. When are older versions of the CLI going to be deprecated?
That's a good question. So that's probably going to be a staged deprecation for the most part. It's going to be because we have like multiple stacks on Aptible, so they're not all going to be deprecated at the same time. But like on shared stacks, deprecation is probably going to start in about a month. So like as of March, it will like stop working on like shared development stacks and gradually stop working everywhere else. You will like start receiving warnings in your CLI pretty soon if you connect using an older CLI to a new SSH portal.
Great. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks. All right. So moving on to changes to databases. So yeah, here again, like the goal is really to give you more options for your databases and more control. So the goal here is to let you like audit like three goals. Like we have database logs that let you audit what your database is doing. We have SSL support in Redis so that you can now use it for PHI. And finally, we have a RabbitMQ management interface to give you control over tasks that exist in RabbitMQ. So database logs, we introduced this a few several weeks ago at this point, I think. So the way they work is really just like for apps. You'll just set up a log drain, and it will start receiving logs from your databases. You can also use Aptible logs to review them, but here again, you'll need to make sure you have a recent CLI, so that's another reason to upgrade getting access to your logs. That being said, one thing to keep in mind for these is that these logs may not always be what you expect them to be. Like we do have like customers that want access to all their queries by default and log everything on the database. Other customers don't want that, just want log slow queries and so on. So the default configuration for most databases on Aptible is pretty silent, but if you'd like to make changes, you can do that. You can very usually do that directly via your database's interface. So if you're using Postgres, for example, you can just like do that from a Postgres like SQL, like a PGSQL session. If you have for this, if you have any questions on how to set things up, or if you would like any guidance, we're of course happy to help. So you can always reach out to us. One case where you will need to reach out to us is for MySQL. If your database was launched prior to last week, it will not be able to log. yeah, it will not be able to like log your queries or like the general query log essentially, all the all slow queries. So in this case, you just need to let us know if you'd like this feature available, and then we'll just reload the database for you. And this will like take about 30 seconds. It will like the database will be unavailable during these 30 seconds. So we'll be happy to scale that off hours for you, so that you don't have to, so that you don't have any downtime when it happens. Frank, do we have any questions on the?
Yeah. Does Aptible have any suggestions for ensuring that PHI is not included in database logs?
Yeah. Did you want to answer that one?
Sure. Yeah, I can grab that. So there's a couple ways that we would answer this. So the first is that we would generally recommend that database logs are probably better suited for performance debugging than audit logging. And so it probably makes sense to, for example, enable slow query logging and use that in your database logs, but it makes not as much sense to use database logging as the sole way for logging access to PHI. And I'll go more on that in a sec, but I guess before that, I will note that log drains can be defined on a per drain basis to apply to either apps or database containers or both. So what you could do is, like, let's say that you really like Papertrail or something for accessing your logs, but Papertrail doesn't sign a BAA, so you can't store PHI there. You can always set up Papertrail as a destination for your app logs, so all of your app logs go there, and you can control and prevent PHI from being logged at your apps. And then you can use a separate internal drain, say an Elasticsearch drain, that's specific for your database logs. So you can mix and match these, and you can have a PHI only log drain for your database logs. Back to the point of why you might want to implement audit logging at the app level. One big consideration is that at the app level, you always know the individual identified user who is accessing PHI, and that's an important component of any PHI audit log. And when you're logging at the database level, often your application will be connecting to the database with a single user, single database user for the whole application. And so you lose that identification of which user was accessing or modifying PHI. So that's kind of why app audit logs are really necessary in addition to whatever you do at the database level. And why we generally think that doing stuff like slow query logging is a lot more applicable for databases.
Thanks, Frank. I did suspect you were getting this question pretty often in support, so if you guys may have full answer that I do. Thanks. Do we have anything else? I don't think I see anything.
Not for right now.
All right. So moving on to
we had someone follow up to that one, and some of you were asked or suggested that it may be possible to inject comments into SQL to include additional info there. So just bringing that up.
That's a good tip. All right. So moving on with our database changes, the next big one is support for SSL on Redis databases. So until now on Aptible, Redis databases only supported the plain text Redis protocol, but now if you launch a new Redis database on Aptible, you will also get an SSL endpoint. Using SSL means that all your data is encrypted like all through to the database, and that means you can use it to stop PHI. So you'll find those credentials like in your dashboard. So if you provision a Redis database, you can just like go to your credentials tab and you'll just find them. They're right there. One thing to mention is SSL will only be available out of the box for recent Redis instances. So like these that were launched before, like after last week, essentially. So if you don't actually see an SSL credential in there, it's probably because your database is a little too old and doesn't actually support that. So just for like MySQL, we can enable that, and we've already done it for several customers. So we can do that on demand. Just reach out to us, and an SSL will be enabled. Now the question you're probably like wondering is like, but SSL is actually a feature of Redis. So how is my client going to work with this? And the good news is that even though SSL is not a feature of Redis itself, most Redis clients do actually support it out of the box. So we'll provide you like with a URL that starts with like Redis S, so note the 2 S's right there. And most clients will actually use that out of the box and use that to mean, oh, I have to connect over SSL, and it will just work for you. So like if ever you, of course, if for some reason your client isn't able to connect or doesn't recognize that URL, make sure you check your documentation. But from like the vast majority of mainstream clients, this will actually work out of the box for you. By the way, you can also use this with the CLI itself. Like some of you are probably using the CLI to tunnel to the Redis database. You can also do that here. You can use like DB tunnel and then like pass like a type argument to explain the type of connection you want. And in this case, you can say you want an SSL connection. Now, I should mention, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Like the traffic from your workstation to Aptible is always encrypted no matter what, even if you don't use the SSL endpoint. It's the traffic from the SSH portal to your Redis instance that becomes encrypted if you use the SSL endpoint, which again is a good idea to if you are running a Redis database with PHI in it. That being said, all of this requires, again, a recent CLI. So this one is open 8.4. So if you just get the latest CLI from aptible.com/support/toolbelt, we showed that link before, that's what you'll get. And this will support tunneling. And it's not just useful for Redis, as you'll find out. It's also going to be useful for RabbitMQ. So RabbitMQ, we did the same thing with RabbitMQ. We have a new port there. It's the management interface. So if you're using RabbitMQ, you can use that to like manage your queues. So if you're not using RabbitMQ, this obviously will not be as interesting. But essentially, the same caveats as Redis apply. If you launch this database, if you did not launch it recently, then you will have to just reach out to us to enable the management interface. But once you've done so, you'll be able to use the Aptible CLI to access the glorious RabbitMQ management interface and get access to your queues. And do we have any? I'm afraid we're running a little behind, but I think we may have had.
Yeah, so one viewer asked what the date was when database logs were implemented, and if it was the same as when we shipped Redis with SSL. And I can answer this. I'm on the blog in case that helps, Thomas. So I believe
so
we
one thing I'd like to mention first is that database logs do not require a database restart. So regardless of how old your database is, you can just launch it, except if it's MySQL, which doesn't log anything. For other databases, you can just start using this right now. As for the actual release dates, Frank, I'll let you get that.
Yeah, so database logs have been available since November 30th of 2016. And for MySQL, I believe you had the date in your slides.
Yeah, January 19. Yeah. Everything about like Redis SSL, MySQL, RabbitMQ, all of this shipped last week on the 19th.
Right. So if you do have a MySQL database and you want to enable general logging or slow query logging, and you haven't provisioned that database in the last week, just contact us.
All right. And to wrap this up, we have the Windows CLI. So this one is pretty straightforward. The CLI used to only be available, at least officially. We have some customers that were able to work around this. But the CLI was only available on Unix, like on Linux and Mac OS, essentially. But that's not the case anymore. Now, you can, if you're using Windows, you can download the CLI and it will just work. You will, however, need a reasonably recent version of Windows. So the requirements are right there on the slide. But you'll need Windows 8.1 for the desktop side or 2002 on the server side. In both cases, you'll need a 64-bit OS. So with that, we essentially have support for like all mainstream OSs. So like that's OS X, Windows, Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, and also CentOS. And that's also probably what we call the Aptible tool belt. At this point, you're probably wondering why I'm telling you to download the tool belt to update your CLI. So one thing I should mention is the tool belt is essentially a package that like contains the Aptible CLI and a bunch of other stuff you need to run said CLI. So like an example of other stuff you need is the actual like like you'll need like the actual like Ruby interpreter because the CLI is written in Ruby. You need a recent version of OpenSSH. So all of this comes via the CLI so that you have like an environment that's essentially guaranteed to work. It's also a little faster than installing it as a gem, which was the original way to install it. That being said, like if you absolutely want to, it's of course possible to not use the tool belt, but the tool belt makes it essentially easier to just like get started and running the CLI. And that's it for well, that's like an Enclave Q&A because I wrote it. But if we had any questions on the Gridiron as well, I think we can probably answer these as well.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Thomas. Yeah, so if you do have any additional questions, we have a few minutes here at the end to answer them. So just dump them in the Q&A or chat or DM me. The first question we got, this one's going to be for Skylar and Chaz. How does Gridiron training work? So can you tell us a little bit more about the training product and what's involved there?
Yeah, I can grab that, Frank. Basically, any new user that joins your Aptible organization is going to be assigned basic training. You can turn that off for a given user. So if you have like a robot user that does your deployments, you can remove their training assignments so you get all the green check marks. That's for basic training. The other advanced training programs, so for developer training or security officer training, right now you have to go to that training dashboard, the screenshot that I showed, and find the user and click assign next to that training program. We're still in the process of rolling out being able to access that content on the dashboard itself. Basic training is on the dashboard. The advanced programs are still handled by a webinar session with Chaz directly, but once that content is published, those will all be completed from dashboard.
Awesome. Thanks, Skylar. Mm-hmm. So one additional question. This one's going to be for Thomas on Enclave. So what is required to view the RabbitMQ, the HTTP management dashboard? So viewing the queues. And so can you just recap those steps?
Yeah, sure. So first, you'll need a recently launched RabbitMQ database. So you can see if you launched recently enough by just go to your RabbitMQ database in the Aptible dashboard and just see if this is providing essentially see if it's providing a URL code management. If you have it, you're all set. If not, then you'll need to just reach out to us and just ask us to enable the management interface for you. Once you've done that, then you just need a recent CLI, and you just have to run this one command, which is like dbtunnel, then the name of your database, and then type. That flag is important, --type management. That tells the CLI to connect over the management interface. By the way, if you don't actually have a recent enough RabbitMQ database, now it wasn't related, you'll be, at this point, it will error out and tell you about it. But if it doesn't error out, at this point, you will, essentially, you'll be all set. Your database will, the tunnel will come up, and then you'll just be able to access it at like the URL that's provided by the database, by the Aptible dbtunnel command as it comes up. But again, for this to work, you will also need a recent CLI. So two things you got to update: your RabbitMQ database and your CLI.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas. And then we have a question for Skylar and Chaz about Gridiron. So what infrastructure as a service providers can we use Gridiron with?
Right now, we're shipping with Enclave and AWS. There's not so much a technical restriction to shipping new providers. It's more us taking the time to establish a baseline for a given provider. So Gridiron isn't an open-ended tool where you're necessarily adding everything yourself. We inform a lot of the basic components for a given platform. So traditionally that was just Enclave because we're obviously the experts there. We're moving into AWS with this beta launch of Gridiron. And then as we move forward, we'll start to add other providers once we start to see a need for that and we've taken the time to build the baseline for those providers.
Awesome. Thank you again, Skylar. So that's it for the questions that have been asked in Q&A here. If anyone does have additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can just go to aptible.com/support, and you can find a link there to contact us. You can also just email support@aptible.com, and we're happy to answer any questions that you think of after the fact offline. So I'll just hand it back to Chaz for some closing words here.
Yep, thanks everybody. I appreciate you. I appreciate the questions. We will have the slides and video up. We'll put a link to them on the blog. You'll receive a follow-up email with those materials. And then if you want to register for the next one, it'll be on April 25th, same time. And we'll see you then. So thanks for joining. We appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks, guys.